Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here on behalf of the Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs here at AUB. I'm Joseph Bahout, the director. I'm welcoming you. I'm very happy that you are so numerous today. I would like to start by wishing our guest, Mr. Saadi, a happy Europe's Day. It's a bit belated, but this is the occasion for which we have this event today. It's part of the events that the EU delegation in Lebanon is doing in Lebanon to celebrate, quote unquote, this very important day. For me, at least, the EU has been quite impressively a successful, resilient, and promising construction, and I'm underlying the word construction because it has been a very voluntarist thing that has been done, and that shows for us here in the region, in the Middle East and in Lebanon, at least two things. It shows how we can overcome a very long period and tradition, I would say, of wars and get over them through cooperation, integration, etc. And also the second thing that is very Lebanese, I think, and I'm here quoting your ambassadors, Mrs. Sandra Duval, on Europe's Day at the reception a few days ago, when she said that Europe and Lebanon share at least one feature, which is diversity and unity in diversity. I mean, this kind of very delicate balance. So I think it's an important construction. However, as we know, and many of my students are here, and we talked about it this semester, Europe is meeting also very numerous challenges, and the challenges are, of course, the war in Europe with Ukraine, the US-European relation that is in question, of course, the rise of contending powers like China, India, etc., and the Middle East, that is the neighborhood of Europe, that is in flux, in transition, in turmoil, in chaos, call it as you wish. So these are the things that we will probably talk about. We are focusing with you, Mr. Saadi, on Europe's action in Lebanon, and we are very happy to have you here. Mr. Saadi is the deputy head of the delegation, so he's number two. I don't know if you're in charge of specific files, you'll tell us. But Lebanon, as you know, is a very solid partner of the EU. We have a neighborhood agreement that I think needs to be upgraded and consolidated. The EU is a very solid supporter of Lebanon on the front of reforms, of technical assistance on many levels. You will tell us about this. Support to civil society, to rule of law, etc., etc. Now, before I give you the floor, I will say that Lebanon is today, I think, we can say it with some caveats and caution, is at the eve of maybe a new era, I hope. And in this new era, there are many things that Europe and Lebanon not only can but have to do together. And you will explain to us how the EU can accompany these reforms and the restructuring of this country, and what does the EU expect from Lebanon also, because it's a two-way street, so you will tell us what are the conditions and what are the expectations that you have, how this European policy is articulated with the other partners of Lebanon, the American policy in Lebanon, Arab and Gulf positions, and their vision of the country. And last but not least, what happened yesterday and before yesterday, which is sort of historical, this sort of new Syria that is emerging and how it will affect Lebanon and the relation between the EU, Lebanon, and Syria, and the Levant in general. So without further ado, I'll give you the floor for whatever time you need in order to answer these questions or anything else that you want to tackle. And thank you very much for your visit to us and for accepting to enlighten us on these points. Thank you. No, it's fine.
Is it okay if I take a few pictures?
Sure, of course.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor. I mean, I get closer, yeah. It's for me to thank you for, first of all, your hospitality and your interest. Very excited to engage with you. I remember being a political science student myself, international relations, going through the studies and discovering international relations, and I'm very thrilled to be here with you and hopefully share some insightful remarks on the EU and especially also on the relations between Lebanon and the EU, indeed, on the entire regions, actually. I myself am in Lebanon for the third time. My name is Sami Saadi, so a lot of people think, hey, you're Lebanese, Lebanese, and unfortunately I have to disappoint. I am German, but my father is Algerian origin, Jazair, so hence the Arabic name. That here in Lebanon, though, people think I must be Lebanese with that name. I'm here for the third time, so as you can see, I may not be Lebanese, but I'm very attached to Lebanon. I was here for the first time in 2007, actually living in Sadat Street, not far from AUB campus, further down in Hamra. My roommates were all at AUB, so I got to see AUB a lot and come to the beautiful campus here while I was doing my research on UNIFIL back then already, on the UNIFIL mandate. I was also interning with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is a German political foundation that does a lot of... Yes, of Wissam Fares. So that was my first time in Lebanon. And then my second time was 16 to 19, not too long ago. A slightly, let's say, easier period for Lebanon, even though people knew that probably the financial and the economic crisis was imminent, was coming, but it hadn't yet arrived. We hadn't had the port explosion. We hadn't had of course not. We'd had the 2006 escalation, but no recent escalation with Israel. So it was a different situation. It was a different background. I was here working at the German embassy, but focusing on Syria. You've also mentioned Syria and interesting developments with the fall of the Assad regime and now also the loosening of the sanctions, of the US sanctions. But we'll get to that. And now I'm back as deputy of the European Union delegation. That's something we can do as a member state of the European Union. When you're a diplomat of a member state, you can apply for positions in the European Union diplomatic service, external action service. So that's something I did, and it worked out, and I was very happy to come back. And here I am today in front of you. I've only arrived in September, so I'm at the beginning of my 3 to 4 year term. Without further ado, what I do as a number 2, indeed, of the deputy, basically, to Sandra Deval, that appeared at the Europe Day, but has also had a couple of engagements more recently with AUB, but also other universities. I basically take charge when she's not in country. That's the first task. The second task is I am also working a lot on the political situation, on the bilateral relations with Lebanon, the visits, making sure everybody meets the right people, reporting on the situation here, which thankfully now is a more positive agenda we're reporting on. When I arrived in September, it was all about the escalation, reporting almost every day about the security situation and the displacement and the need for humanitarian assistance and so on. Now it's a much more positive agenda we're reporting on with the new president and the new prime minister and the new government. And also making sure that our different sections, and I'll come to that, how the EU delegation is constructed, work together more closely. Because as you know, we have, and you mentioned that, you alluded to that, we have a big cooperation section that does a lot of programming, technical support assistance, cooperation with Lebanon. That's programming side, and we have a political side. And what my task also is to make sure that these go hand in hand, also in our exchanges with the Lebanese government. Maybe I'll leave it at that, otherwise it'll become too technical, and give you a brief introduction on what the EU is. You're all very versed and well-informed students, so I won't go into all the details, but I thought it would still be important to understand, like you said, the genesis and why the EU came together. Before then, I describe the current setup of the European Union and talk about, of course, EU-Lebanon relations. and how we see them going forward. Interrupt me if I'm too long, if I'm boring or anything. I'm not I'm not going to be mad. I want this to be interactive, so I'll start with this input, but I'm very happy to hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and answers going forward. So there is bad news, there is a PowerPoint presentation. It's a bit old school of us, I know, but we'll try to. Tatiana did a great job, and colleagues preparing it, and we'll be sure to make it as interactive as possible. Great. We can go ahead and look at the map. Exactly. I mean, most of you know, but I think it's still interesting, important to see it geographically, right? The countries that the EU is opposed of. Great Britain, you have to kind of put a parenthesis out of it because they left the EU, as we all know. They regret that decision, just for the record. And as you know, we're very, very close, right? We've got Lebanon right here. Cyprus is still part of the European Union, so you've got, with Cyprus, you really have a member state that's basically not at all far from the shores of Lebanon. So you probably know also about the initial European countries, and then the enlargement, particularly towards the Eastern Europe. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. It's 27 countries by now, almost half a billion inhabitants, 24 official languages. We're talking about diversity. 24 official languages and different languages. Of course, also different religions. A big diversity, similarly to Lebanon, in terms of different religions and appartenance. But for 20 out of the 27 countries, we have one currency, which was one of the big achievements as well of European integration. Without going into too much details on how it began, we're still going to quickly allude to what I think is very important, is why did the European Union come together and how did it come together? We all know that the European Union emerged out of World War II. I myself am German, and that's why for me it's very important to emphasize that it is born out of the horrible experience of the Nazi Germany invading not just most of the continent, but other parts of the world as well, and diving the whole world into a world war. So it's very important to say that one of the bases of the European integration is relatively early, I have to say, right? Relatively early after the atrocities of World War II, the recognition by leaders of different European countries, but first and foremost also French and German leaders, that after 3 wars actually between Germany and France, it was time to move on to something else. And I have to say that from the French point of view, but also from the Belgian, Dutch point of view, all countries that had been invaded by Nazi Germany, it was quite remarkable to just a few years later say, well, you know what, we think we should work with these people, with these neighbors, instead of continue fighting. It was a slightly different situation after World War I, where there was a lot of revenge in the minds, which was after the Versailles Treaty, which ultimately led to more conflict. So I think there was also this lesson from post-World War I to say, post-World War II, we want to play it differently. Also cannot overemphasize the role of the United States back then, of also funding and supporting the reconstruction of Germany, and then also in this way enabling the economic integration of the EU. So the initial thought was, if we create dependencies by showing that by working together economically, there is more added value than by fighting and trying to invade each other, we can start creating this nucleus, this nucleus of an integration. And there were several leaders. I'll just point out one, Robert Schuman, that had this visionary back then. We have to look at the situation back then. It was a very visionary approach, and we're very good at ultimately also convincing political leaders of their approach. So that was 1950, the Schuman Declaration, leading to political leaders of the core Europe back then, which was basically Benelux, Germany, France, Italy, coming together and agreeing on the European Coal and Steel Community. And then later, the real breakthrough in terms of European integration was the Rome Treaty. That was then followed up by additional treaties that further enshrined and further generalized the European integration. The single market, of course, in 1993 was another big step, because that basically meant that there was going to be, in principle, free movement of capital, of labor technically as well. That took a while, but that was the idea, to really integrate the economies of Europe. And we have all benefited from it. All European countries have benefited from it. Introduction of the euro, and then the enlargement that I was mentioning on the map to the Eastern European countries post end of Cold War and German reunification. Basically, the integration of post-Soviet countries. Yes. And then, more recently, in 2020, the recognition that while the EU integration is great and it's a wonderful idea, maybe it needs to modernize, and maybe it needs to consider more response to the needs of the new generations of Europeans, which brought us to next generation EU. Now, I'll leave it at that. If you have more questions on the integration, on the history of it, I hope I can answer them. But I will be getting to the current leadership of the European Union that has recently changed, actually. Not at the top, but all the others. So we've had the German president of the European Commission that has started her second term last year, Ursula von der Leyen. We have, but other than having the German president, it's important to note that we've had an increasing number of leaders coming from smaller EU member states, which was something very important, because you didn't want to create the impression with small EU member states that ultimately the Union would be dominated by by Germany, France, back in the days before they left, the UK, or Italy, Spain. So it's very important also to, in the leadership, reflect that. While there is still a German president of the European Commission, but this will change after the next mandate. There is, for example, a high representative, which is my direct boss, not direct, but like my overall boss at the European External Action Service, Kaja Kallas, who is from Estonia, a country that joined with the Eastern enlargement and that is relatively small. Antonio Costa, the president of the European Council, is from Portugal. And Roberta Metsola, the president of the European Parliament, is from Malta. So you can see those are not necessarily the biggest and the most influential in terms of size and economic power European countries. That is important. I think it's also important to show diversity in terms of women, gender identity, gender diversity. Having 3 women out of 4 core leaderships of the European Union, I think, is something that we should be proud of. Doesn't mean that Europe has achieved enough gender equality and women's participation globally, but I think having that at the having 3 female leaders at the leadership helps for sure, and is a great example, I think. How are we structured? Okay, I won't get into too much detail because very quickly it becomes very bureaucratic, and I don't want to bore you. But what's important to know is that basically you've got this trias of institutions that work together and have different roles. You have, of course, the European Parliament, which is elected in all the different member states. So you will have candidates for the EU Parliament. We don't have candidates for the whole of Europe yet. I mean, the ideal would be to have candidates no matter from which country they're from, and if you're in another country, you can vote for them. We don't have that, but what we have is that in your own member state, in your own country, like let's say for me, Germany, I can vote for candidates of different political parties for them to to join the European Parliament. There are some parties popping up right now that have the aspiration to be European political parties and not just national European political parties, which is a relatively new development. Then we have the European Commission, which is the core really of the day-to-day work of the European Union, with the President von der Leyen that you've seen, 6 vice presidents, and 20 commissioners who are like ministers in your Council of Ministers for different files. I think one that is very important for Lebanon and our relationship is Commissioner Suiza, who was here in February, who is the new commissioner. It was created because we wanted to emphasize the relationship between the European Union and its Mediterranean neighbors, which is the Director General for the Mediterranean and North Africa and the Middle East, which is shortened as DG MENA, but it goes beyond just Middle East and North Africa. It also includes, actually, because you were talking about the relation with the Gulf countries, it also includes the Gulf countries. So she was here and had very good meetings with President Aoun shortly after his nomination and his election. Was it already? Did he meet with prime ministers? Yeah, he was. It was before the formation. It was after already. Exactly, the Parliament had already elected the prime minister, but the government hadn't been formed and confirmed by Parliament yet when she was here. And then we have the Council of the EU, which is basically the main forum where the member states come together. Court of Justice, important, and then who I work for directly is the European External Action Service, which is separate from the EU Commission but works closely with it. Okay. Now, let's accelerate things a little bit. I won't delve into the role of the High Representative. It's basically the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Sorry? Oh, okay, don't worry. It's in mine still, but don't worry. It's Kaja Kallas is basically the Foreign Minister of the European Union, to simplify things. And she's hoping to come in fall. It's not confirmed yet, but she's hoping to come to Lebanon in fall. Now, moving on to the next slide, you had mentioned the first war in Europe since World War II. And that is something that really has changed the mindset of the European Union. It was something that shouldn't have come as a surprise, knowing how Russia had been trying already, had annexed Crimea in 2014 and had already before that infringed on European EU member states and other neighbors in the East. But it did take the EU by surprise, to be very honest with you, and we were not prepared for this. And so it became a very central focus of the European Union to stand with Ukraine, to support Ukraine in defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity, and hopefully to find a just peace and solution to the current conflict. The EU was rightfully criticized for this focus because we started really focusing on ourselves and only our eastern neighborhoods because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so there was a lot of criticisms from this region, but also from other regions of the world, that the EU was ultimately being selfish and just looking at itself. I just want to emphasize how important, what of a shock the invasion was and how it affected the European psyche and its member states, and that kind of explains why so much focus and so much money as well of the EU budget was ultimately focused on Ukraine. I think what's come out of this, and you also alluded to the new US administration and the slightly more difficult relationship between the US and the EU that have been in the past rather close, not always agreeing, but have been close partners. We can dive into that if you're interested in the Q&A, but indeed that was one of the reasons that now there's a lot of focus on a European defense. Of course, we still believe in NATO, and NATO is still a defense cooperation that the EU believes in, but we also realize that we cannot count on the US any longer as we had, maybe too much in the past. There were member states who have always wanted more European ownership in defense, like France and others, but others like Germany, my own countries, have always been pushing back and said, oh, we can ultimately count on the Americans, we'll be fine. Which turned out, I have to admit, as a German, although I'm a German, I have to admit, turned out to be a bit naive in hindsight. Over to maybe what's relevant and important for you. I think we were mentioning the EU's intention to rethink and refocus the relationship to our, let's say, southern and southeastern neighbors in the Middle East and in North Africa. There is basically this idea to rework on a new pact for the Mediterranean. There used to be a union for the Mediterranean, used to be a lot of processes to try to bring the two regions together. For one reason or the other, they have all in a way not failed, but not borne the fruit that we had all hoped for and expected. And the EU has also not been able to deliver to the countries of this region what we had ultimately promised in terms of economic cooperation and growth and support for that. Of course, one reason is the geopolitics, and one reason is the situation in the south of Lebanon, basically the Middle East conflict and the lack of solutions and resolutions of this, which has rendered full cooperation of all the countries of the region very difficult. Now, what we're trying to do now is having a new framework on shared interests of the region and of the European Union, and then also having individual agreements with individual countries, because of course the countries of the Mediterranean don't all have the same expectations and needs, that will be negotiated going forward in the coming months with the new government. What else? I think what's important to, also for Lebanon in particular, to emphasize is that the EU wants to continue, and now it's more important than ever, to fight for multilateralism and UN principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity that have been increasingly questioned. I'm sure in your classes of political science, international relations, you talk about these concepts, but they're not just concepts. You as Lebanese know what sovereignty and territorial integrity means because you have been so heavily affected by breaches of exactly those. Be it during the civil war under Syrian tutelage, be it under the repeated incursions and occupations by Israel. I think Lebanon knows exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the importance of protecting and maintaining and defending sovereignty and territorial integrity. And if what you've mentioned, the new U.S. administrations, we've heard, let's be very honest, slightly crazy ideas. We don't hope that they will follow up on them, but all these threats of taking over Canada, of taking over Greenland, of taking over Panama because of the Panama Canal are indeed very frightening if you see at the same time that Russia has been proactively trying to take over parts of an independent country, that is Ukraine. So as the European Union, we believe we need to step up more than we did before for the respect and maintenance of these principles and ultimately for the maintenance of the UN and the UN system that is, we believe, under threat right now. Pardon? Yes. You had the links on how to inform yourself more about the EU, but we can distribute that later. Jumping to Lebanon right away, and for example, especially the relationship between the European Union and Lebanon, that is a quite telling picture. I think you all know that in the last couple of months, the EU had to focus on. Unfortunately, we tried to, our previous High Representative Joseph Borrell, I don't know if some of you have heard the name, he was the predecessor of Kaya Kallas, has done his best and really tried to engage in regional diplomacy to prevent the escalation that happened in late September here in Lebanon and the Israeli airstrikes and basically the escalation of the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. But unfortunately, these diplomatic efforts failed, and so ever since, the airstrikes got so heavily intensified that millions of Lebanese got displaced from the south or from southern Beirut as well. What the EU has been focusing on is basically direct support, immediate support to the most affected populations in Lebanon, the displaced, but also the host communities, and trying to basically ensure that people would still get access and their basic needs fulfilled. At the same time, diplomatically, the EU and individual member states such as France have immediately pushed to achieve a ceasefire as quickly as possible under the overall parameters of still very relevant UN Security Council Resolution 1701. I'm sure I don't need to tell you about 1701. You know what it's about. And this is something that the EU has always from the outset said. Basically, this conflict has to stop and end as quickly as possible. And we also need to then work towards a... Oh, fantastic. I will be very happy to read it.
Very, very useful document.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks.
The comparison between 1701 and the new ceasefire.
And the new ceasefire agreement of the mechanism.
Yeah.
Okay, that's important. We can get into that because that is currently a topic, an issue that we're working on. It was a picture. We stole it from you. Copyright infringement. Sorry. So I think what's important during the conflict and also now with the ceasefire agreement and the monitoring mechanism, what the EU is insisting on is that the parameters and the obligations under 1701 and under the ceasefire agreement. First of all, it's important to say the ceasefire agreement does not replace 1701. So we see it as part of it, but they need to be implemented and met by all parties. So I think this is something the EU has stood for, and we've also raised that issue with Israel and the government, the Israeli government. It is very important. While we feel like Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces are really doing a great job since the ceasefire in dismantling infrastructure, military infrastructure south of the Litani, they really picked up their efforts and work, and the government itself is very proactively trying to resolve all other issues in relation with 1701 and 1559. But that at the same time, what we need to see is for the Israeli side to also withdraw from Lebanese territory in those 5 remaining points and 2 buffer zones, and also stop the daily breaches and the daily airstrikes on Lebanon, because this is, in our view, part of the ceasefire agreement and should be accordingly respected. So this message is passed on to the Israeli government. Right now, to not much, unfortunately, result, but this is something the EU and the High Representative herself continuously states in her meetings. So we are for that very reason, in addition to the humanitarian support that I've mentioned, we're now focusing on supporting the new Lebanese government. We were also quite excited to see that there would be a president after a long gap, and that there's basically a government that we feel, and the ambassador Sandra de Waal actually confirms that is very proactive and that has ministers that are really trying to use the limited time that they have until the next parliamentary elections to get things moving, to get reforms on the right track. This is something that we really appreciate, and we try to support as much as we can politically, but also through active cooperation and support, technical support also to the ministry to implement these reforms. That is very important. We are also supporting the Lebanese armed forces. Very important to mention that. Yes, you got to the right slide. Thank you, Tatiana. Mostly it's deployment to the south, so it can reassert the presence of the state and the monopoly of violence of the state also in the south, which we all have to see and admit in the last decades has been rather difficult, if not impossible. So this is great progress. But also at the border with Syria, that's also something we support. With the regime change, with the fall of the Assad regime, while hopefully in the medium to long term, it will be positive. There will be positive effects, including for Lebanon, in terms of regional trade, in terms of much better relations with your neighbor, a relation of equals, rather than like the past, a relation where Syria was trying to impose on Lebanon. Right now, the challenges are immense on the border, on the lack of security there, on the Syrian side. So we are supporting the Lebanese armed forces in trying to manage the border. And we also believe that it's very important to, at the same time, help reform and strengthen the internal security forces, the ISF, the police basically here in Lebanon, because we've seen in the past decades that the Lebanese armed forces have had to play the role also of domestic security, something that is not originally their mandate. And since they have so much on their plate with the border in the south, with the border in the east and the north, and so on and so forth, we believe it is very important to further strengthen the internal security forces, and that's what we are trying to do and support. Now, and I'm almost done, I promise. On reforms and good governance, I think it's important. I've mentioned it, but there's some numbers for you. This is basically support both to the government and technical support to the ministries and line ministries, but also to civil society, of course, because we believe that civil society continues. And Lebanon is quite strong compared to other countries in this region, and we do believe that civil society can play a very positive role also in pushing for reforms, pushing for transparency, pushing for fighting corruption. They have done so, and we want to continue support them do so. Over to, look, I'll go quickly through it. There's a support that started, we have to be very honest with you. It's a support that started because of the Syrian refugee crisis here in Lebanon. So basically, with the arrival of over 1.5 million Syrian refugees here in this country, of course, many countries have realized that we need to support Lebanon with this incredible high, proportionally also, number of refugees. And we cannot leave you alone. I know it's been controversial at times, and there has been criticism, and I understand that, but what we've in more recent years really tried to do is to emphasize how we're not only helping Syrians in Lebanon, but it's very important for us to help Lebanon, Lebanese institutions, the education sector, the health sector, all these public sectors that Syrian refugees benefit of, but also most Lebanese benefit of, to make sure that it is support to the Lebanese and the host communities, and also to Syrian refugees. I think that's something that we had to learn with the years, but that we've been much, much better at doing, and will continue to do so. Understanding that with the opening in Syria, we're all hoping that in the medium term, hopefully sooner than later, there will be scope for more returns. We do believe, and most Syrian refugees in Lebanon see their future in Syria, and hopefully the security situation and the economic situation, that's something we're also actively working on, can be improved sufficiently so they can return. In the meantime, we will continue our support to Lebanon to basically manage the burden. I'll leave it at that. And questions. The humanitarian assistance is also detailed. I don't think we need to go into more detail. And there's an overview exactly of the different sectors we support. And if you're interested in studying this more broadly, we're happy to share the presentation with the numbers. Very happy to do so. Exactly. We'll leave it on the computer. Rather than continuing to go through the presentation, I think it's a good time to stop and open it up for questions.